Linux Luddites, episode 71, for the 8th of February, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. And this fortnight, we have some Linux distributions doing some new and newsworthy activities, so we'll get stuck into them in the news segment, as well as look over the wider tech, of course involving some phones and containers. Joe talks to Graham Morrison about the Linux Voice team's new book, Beep Beep Yarr. We of course cover your feedback. And finally, the three of us get all snowden and review the amnesic incognito live distro, Tails OS. So with all that show bursting to get out, let's dash over to the news desk and see what the Mint team are up to.
Well, as Jesse said, let's start with Linux Mint and their X apps, which are not just rebadged versions of GTK apps at all, definitely. No, they're brand new things. Now, to be fair, what we're talking about here are desktop independent applications that will work across the various versions of Linux Mint and potentially other distros if people want to use them. Whereas before they were concentrating on Cinnamon applications, they didn't really want to do that. They wanted to make sure that they could just write it once and then it would look good on either Cinnamon, Mate or XFCE, basically all of the GTK desktops.
So what's the problem they're actually trying to address here? I mean, why don't things look good across the desktops?
Well, it's where GNOME have gone and made more and more things that are specific for their desktop. So rather than being able to swap out, for example, the window headers and borders and things, the GNOME ones come with those massive kind of clunky ones and they're embedded in the app. And so you can't get them out. So you end up with maybe the GNOME header and then the GTK header over the top for Cinnamon or whatever it is. So they look really out of place. So it looks like the Mint team have got some GTK apps that are not the GNOME sort of standard ones and recoded them to allow them to be, as Joe said, sort of independent of which GTK desktop environment you're running.
So they're forking existing apps. I mean, why aren't they thinking about forking existing toolkits?
Because that's an awful lot more work.
It is, but it would give them an awful lot more control as well, wouldn't it? I mean, the way they're going at the moment, they're still beholden to what GTK does.
Well, that's true, but they only have a certain number of developer hours per month. And I know that they are raking in the cash left, right, and center, but still, there's only so far that cash will go. But I do take your point that maybe they should try and take more control, but they are spread fairly thin, aren't they? I mean, they've got 3 or even 4 distros to deal with. No, more than that, because there's the KDE version as well, and there's LMDE. So for them to take on such a major development task, I think is beyond them. And so this is the second best way of going about it, I think.
Oh, it'll be interesting to see how it pans out, because a lot of people were very dubious when they announced they were doing Cinnamon, and that has turned out very well indeed. I mean, nobody thought they actually had the chops to pull that one off, so maybe in the fullness of time they'll get around to forking GTK.
Well, the next bit of news we've got is on Adapt. So this has been announced at scale, and it's sort of a twist on the apt package management. So it's for Ubuntu, and it allows you to use LXD system containers to install any Ubuntu application from any version of Ubuntu onto any other version of Ubuntu. So where this is really powerful, or where they think it's going to be most useful, is where a lot of people like to run the LTSs, or if you've got a server or something that you want to keep with the LTS. When new software comes out, you don't always get to use that software. So by having it containerized and able to install onto older systems, you can have the most modern software in a container on your older system.
I can see this being really, really useful if it works well. I mean, just this week, it came up, this issue of being stuck on the LTS with an old version, because my wife's just discovered Critter, and so she's been doing some various paintings in that. It's a nice free software painting app, but in the Ubuntu LTS version, well, Ubuntu LTS version that we've got, 14.04, you're stuck on this older version of it. And she had seen on Facebook or something that, there's a new version out. And I said to her, oh, well, yeah, you're never going to get that on this, I'm afraid, until we update to 16.04. So if we could actually install it easily using Adapt, this new version that's come out, that would be great.
Well, sticking with things announced at conferences recently, at FOSDEM this time, Jonathan Riddle announced KDE Neon. Now, we've come across a KDE Neon project in the past, but this is something slightly different. And it uses Ubuntu long-term support as a base again, but it will be providing recent builds of KDE on top. And whilst we're still waiting for 16.04 to drop, they're going to be using 15.10 in the meantime. They won't go all the way back to 14.04, presumably for the reasons that we've already mentioned on the show. And they're planning a user edition, which will include the latest officially released KDE software stack, and a developer edition, which will feature daily builds and updates. Now, both will only be 64-bit, and they've made a big thing about this not actually being a distribution, and therefore not in competition with things like Kubuntu. But, I don't know, it kind of looks that way to me.
I'm inclined to agree with you. I think that it is a distro. It seems that it's just a more up-to-date version of Kubuntu. So you've got this kind of mashup between the old LTS and also the newer version of Kubuntu. So it's the best of both worlds. And I don't know, maybe I'm generalizing here, but the kind of person who's into KDE and Kubuntu is surely more likely to want those newer features that come with the newer versions of KDE. So I can see it, just making the LTS of Kubuntu much less attractive.
It's got the classic claim of a solid core, sitting on the LTS, but the latest features. And I always wonder how you can ever have solid and maintainable and the latest features not breaking things. So it'd be interesting to see if they only have things like the KDE desktop, or whether it has the KDE apps as well, and then other applications. And where do you sort of draw the line between latest features and leaving it as the LTS? Not quite sure, but I think they're going to have to make a bigger point of it not being a distro, because it has all the sights of being a distro.
Well, I mean, look at Linux Mint. That is a perfect example. They are now sticking on the LTS for 2 years and then updating things like Cinnamon and making it so that you have got the latest desktop features if you want them, while still having the stability of the LTS. So I don't think it's impossible. I think it is a reasonable amount of work, but Linux Mint have proved that it is possible.
Yeah, and to do so, have made a whole distribution out of it.
Yeah, which we're looking at here in reality, KDE Neon. So speaking of Ubuntu, there was a little bit of news this week, and I'll give it a couple of minutes, I suppose. The Convergent tablet has finally been announced. Wow, how exciting. I don't know. I know I'm usually really negative about things, but it just feels like way too little too late to me. A tablet, a 10-inch tablet, who even wants one of those these days? Tablet sales have been waning for quite some time now, and people don't really update them very often, do they? It's not like a phone. What we needed was either this 4 or 5 years ago or a phone a couple of years ago with this convergence. So what are we talking about exactly with this convergence? We're talking about a 10-inch tablet that runs Ubuntu Touch that may or may not rotate into portrait mode. We'll have to see, depending on, if you look at the publicity shots, it looks like it does, but let's not get too hung up on that. But it just functions as a normal Ubuntu Touch tablet, although it's got a slightly tweaked interface by the looks of things to take advantage of the bigger 10-inch screen. But then hook up a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse, and hey presto, it turns into an Ubuntu desktop with Windows and all the stuff that you'd expect. And then plug in an HDMI cable to a screen, and then you've got a desktop computer with 2 gigs of RAM and a MediaTek processor. Let's see how that fares.
Yeah, they've teamed up with BQ again. So this is actually the BQ Aquarius M10, which you can already buy with Android. There's obviously tweaked the Ubuntu Touch distribution to run on it. And I agree, I think it's probably a bit underpowered, but the point you made about the size of the tablet, I can't think of anyone who's bought a large tablet in the last couple of years. I've been very happy with my 7-inch tablet and couldn't think that I'd want a much bigger one. So I do struggle to think as to how popular this will be. I think if a phone comes out with it, and you said about the changing interface, I think that's one of those sort of organically changing dimensions. So it's a small set for the phone, a medium kind of touch interface for the tablet, and then, as you say, the full window experience with the desktop. I think if a phone came out, it would be a lot more popular, a lot more something that you could buy and use, because it'd be useful to be able to just pull it out your pocket, go to someone's house and steal a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse, and off you go. But I don't think you're going to carry a 10-inch tablet around. You'd probably just have a laptop.
I mean, the power was something I noticed as well as you two guys, and I think in a way it's a good thing it is a relatively underpowered device, because if it's the only one out there and it's the only one Ubuntu are publicly working to at the moment and that is in front of everybody, surely that will encourage them to hone the distro down so it does actually run well on low-powered hardware, and therefore when it does come out on something flashier, it'll absolutely fly.
Well, you'd hope so, but the problem is going to be only having 2 gigs of RAM, because if you want to run a browser with a lot of tabs in it or any sort of proper desktop software, then 2 gigs is a serious limit. I mean, I have found with my Chromebook running Linux Mint that I often hit that 2 gigs of RAM limit, and in the same way as a tablet, there's no way to upgrade that on my Chromebook, so I'm just stuck having to just not multitask on it. And the whole point of a desktop PC is that you can do multitasking. You can do more with it than a tablet or a phone.
Yeah, presumably you're talking about Firefox there, which we're going to come back to in the feedback.
Well, Firefox, Chrome, any browser.
Oh, come on, Chrome doesn't do that. It sips memory.
Well, like you say, we'll come to it in the feedback, but I'm disappointed that my prediction is already being taken out of my hands. So all they have to do now is deliver it, which they're apparently, I think they're aiming for April. And so I can see my prediction from this year already falling through my hands. However, moving on to LibreOffice, they have been making changes to some of the menus and things. Now, don't worry, they're not bringing in ribbons and crazy kind of Office type things, but they've written some human interface guidelines, and with the upcoming 5.1 release, they're going to try and change the sort of file and edit menus and the arrangement of the submenus within them to try and follow these guidelines. Now, just a couple of examples of the human interface guidelines that they've written. For example, don't have more than 10 menu categories within a menu bar. Don't have more than 20 items within a single menu. Don't have more than 3 sub-levels within a menu, just to sort of make things try and focus on the ease of use and ease of access to the various, or the many menus and options and editing facilities they have across their suite of applications.
Yeah, it might not be the most exciting story in the world, but I was really pleased to see this, which is why I put it into the news. I mean, it doesn't work particularly well on radio or on a podcast, but if you go and look at the images they put up on the website to demonstrate what they're talking about, you can immediately see that it all makes a lot more sense than it used to. Stuff used to be scattered about and not logically grouped. The same sort of functionality between the different apps was accessed in different ways, and it's looking a lot saner now, and I'm really pleased to see this.
Is it going to be enough, though, to compete with Microsoft?
Or moving some menus around the place and making them more logical will help adoption. I always found it a nightmare and a bit of a mission trying to search through them all to find out where the thing that I wanted to do was. So yeah, but grouping them, categorizing them makes sense. But ultimately, to compete with Office, you've got to have better integration or better compatibility with the doc format and the docx format. And until that happens, you're not going to be able to compete one-to-one, because people are producing stuff in the proprietary docx or XLSX formats, and then you lose all that formatting when you bring it in. It's difficult to move between the two. But fingers crossed, those things going on behind the scenes as well.
Well, staying with the topic of competition then, let's cast our eyes eastwards. And India. India's smartphone user base apparently grew to 220 million by the end of last year, and is now bigger officially than the USA. And although Samsung was the leading retailer there, they've only got about a quarter of the total market share, and almost half of all the mobile phones sold in India last year were actually made in India.
Now, that's something I had no idea about. I had no idea that there were Indian-made smartphones. I mean, I suppose that's just ignorance here, but the fact that they're doing so well, seriously competing with Samsung, makes me wonder, are they going to start exporting them? Are we going to start getting some Indian-made smartphones anytime soon? And are they going to be any good? Well, if you look at the ones China have exported, then maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads into the next story, which was about how Samsung and Apple are holding on to their top and second positions globally. Chinese manufacturers really are eating into the market share, and particularly Huawei. And obviously I'm a proud owner, well, slightly embarrassed owner of a Huawei G300, which I've had for a few years, which is a dog of a phone, but there you go. But Huawei are now the fourth best-selling brand in the world.
Yeah, I mean, the problem they have here is that while Apple, it can really be sort of taken out of this conversation somewhat because they have a very, they make their own hardware, their own OS. No one else can touch either of those. And so they rise and fall on their own merit. And there's no competition for their operating system. But when you look over at Android, because it's open and many different manufacturers can put it onto their phones, you're not really, Android's now at the point where it's good enough no matter which phone you put it on. So you can put it on as stock and it'll work well. It works probably better as stock than all these changes and alterations that come out. So what you're then competing on is the hardware. And Chinese manufacturers can make perfectly good hardware very cheaply. And so why would you buy an expensive HTC or if Nokia still made them or an expensive Samsung? And it's really sort of taking the bottom out of the market, isn't it?
Yeah, the increasing commoditization of hardware as well. I was struck by a story in The Verge, and I'll put a link in the show notes, that asks the question, but sort of the other way around, which is why on earth all these manufacturers are still making these handsets when it is such a commodity market and they aren't actually making any money out of it.
Well, I read that, and the conclusion there seemed to be that you've got to be seen to be making a smartphone. Otherwise, you seem to be an irrelevant company with the rest of the tech that you're trying to sell, because smartphones are ubiquitous. Everybody has one. So you have to be seen to be making them.
So it's much like the excuse that we have for advertising, which is it's not trying to sell you something, it's just actually trying to get the brand in front of you and aware of their presence.
Yeah, it is a bit like that, I suppose. It's almost a lost leader. The likes of LG have to be seen to be making this high-end phone so that then you'll have more confidence to buy their tellies and stuff that they actually make some money on.
And there's obviously been some reaction to this from Google themselves, and they're wanting to take over control of Nexus devices far more than they have in the past.
Would that be a good thing, I wonder? Would it mean that you'd have better quality control on them if you don't have an OEM, this kind of too many cooks situation? If it's just Google saying, this is the software we're going to put on it, this is exactly the hardware we want, this is exactly the design we want, make it for us, rather than having this back and forth and probably endless meetings. Can you imagine the meetings that must go on about, the curve here and stuff, hours and hours wasted on it? Whereas if you've just got it all internally at Google, then maybe it will end up with a better product.
Well, historically, of course, Google have gone to the sort of weaker suppliers, if you like, to make the Nexus devices. I mean, Samsung's the obvious exception, but they were a smaller phone manufacturer at the time. But it looks very much as if they're going to try and tread the same path as Apple and put out high-end devices under their own brand now. And I wonder how much space actually is in the marketplace for those sort of devices, particularly when most of the world can't afford them and are quite happy with locally made handsets.
But I don't think the Nexus devices have ever been things to be sold in China and India and these sorts of places. Like I say, if half of the Indian smartphones have been made in India, yet we've never heard of the manufacturers, it's a world that we don't sort of populate or have much contact with. So I get the impression as well that for example, the 6P, it was a step up in price compared to the sort of the rest of the Nexus devices that have been out recently. And they're not trying to sell that to developing markets. They're trying to sell that to the same places which are buying Apple, which is sort of America, the West, and the more affluent Chinese and things like this. And so I'm not sure that it's something they're going to do to try and compete in those markets. I hope they've seen a mistake by bringing out a more expensive Nexus device, because I don't know anyone who's bought one, but I know loads of people who have a Nexus 5 because it was a great phone and at a really good price.
Well, it first started with the Nexus 6. That was a ridiculous price compared to the Nexus 4, which was dirt cheap, and the Nexus 5, which was a little bit more, but still reasonable. And now they've kind of split it in half, haven't they? They've got the 5X, which is quite reasonably priced, and then the 6P, which is the premium one. So they're kind of covering both aspects of the higher end. But you're right, I don't think they're trying to compete with these cheaper phones that are being sold in the developing markets. But something that was definitely a premium device was Google Glass. And I remember, well, that was the first time I ever met you, Jesse. IRL, as they say.
Yes, IRL, yeah.
Yeah. Was at the Google Glass event. And I remember being really impressed with it until I found out it was £1,000. And I thought, right, I won't be buying that then. And it was just a bit of a flop, really. It never went to market. You could be part of the Explorer program and pay this £1,000 and be a tester of it. But it just hasn't come to fruition. And they announced that they weren't doing it anymore. I think that was last year, wasn't it? It was quite some time ago. And now they've deleted their accounts from various social media sites. So it's looking like Google Glass is totally dead now. But maybe it'll be replaced by something similar with a new name.
Isn't this that Aura kind of thing? Because I thought the Google Glass got put to one side and they were like, but you wait for our next Aura, whichever one it was.
Well, either way, that isn't going to be the name that it ends up with, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think it's aimed at Joe Public either, is it? I mean, the whole product category still does make sense in certain specialist situations. I mean, sort of engineering or maintenance, for instance. You can make a good case for having that information in front of your face as opposed to carrying around manuals and what have you. But definitely not for just people walking down the street and watching YouTube.
Yeah, it just seems like a bit of a novelty idea that just doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it? To the real world. As you said, there might be some niche applications of it, but it wasn't virtual reality, it was augmented reality. But then again, still having used it, it wasn't proper augmented reality as I would want it. I would want to be able to look at a wall and there be a huge screen there playing, a movie or whatever. Whereas this was more just a tiny little low-res screen with some basic information on it. And why not just look at your phone for that, or even your watch? But when it comes to virtual reality, Google Cardboard has done pretty well. Google says that they've sold 5 million, 5 million have been bought of these Google Cardboard VR headsets. But the question that I have to ask is, how many of those Google Cardboard headsets are sitting in a box or a drawer? So let's just do a quick survey of people on this podcast. How many people have got one?
Here.
How many people have got one in a box or a drawer?
Here. Yeah. So I have a spare phone, my old S3, and I've loaded all the sort of cardboardy type apps on it so you can play around and not have to drain your phone. And if it slips out the side, which it sometimes does, my heart doesn't skip a beat as it falls to the floor. But it has not been out of the drawer or box in months. It was a funny little quirk and it was good fun, and so showed my cousin at Christmas and that was exciting. But it's not something that I think, oh yeah, I know what, I'll look at Street View. I know what I'll do. I'll get my VR headset and have a look at Street View. I mean, there's a list of the most popular applications, and you can, and Google can find out what it's being used for and things. But I've got to agree with you, Joe. I think you can't say this is a success for two reasons. One, the entry price is so low that you can afford to buy one as a toy or a gimmick and leave it in a drawer and not contemplate it. So you're not really buying it with a lot of forethought. If you're buying a new phone, you put some real thinking into it. But when it's like a £20 cardboard thing, which seems like a cool toy, you can just get it on Amazon and not really think about it. And secondly, like you say, when the novelty wears off, there's not really that many things that are interesting to do with it, so it just goes to one side. And so I don't think it proves that VR is a up and coming force to be reckoned with. If a £300 VR headset was selling at like hotcakes, that would be another story.
I'm not sure. I think that there are certain applications for it, like games, where a VR headset will be really popular. And the Oculus Rift has kind of proven that so far. There's been a lot of interest in it, a lot of buzz. But I think beyond that, as you say, Street View, I'm not going to strap on my VR headset to have Street View or to watch 360-degree videos or whatever. It's something that, you know, you might sit down to do as a particular experience, like I'll sit down to watch a film or I'll sit down to play a game. But I don't think it's going to be this kind of standard part of life like checking my phone is.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's going to take some time for us to see whether or not the VR sort of market really takes off. But moving from Google hardware to Google software, they announced last year that they were going to be bringing in safe browsing with the idea that it would protect you from things like socially engineered attacks. So these are where you go onto a website and they sort of have multiple download links, and only one of them is the actual download and the rest are all things to download, malware and sort of ad injectors and things like this. So they're trying to get around that by bringing a sort of a big red website, basically, where if you go to a website that is known to have these sort of deceptive and difficult to understand sites that maybe pretend to look and feel like a trusted site, but actually have these sort of like nasty little things to click on that can get you into trouble, there'll be a warning saying, are you sure you want to go here? You know, here be dragons kind of thing.
Now, this is one of those stories that seems like a really good idea on the surface of things, doesn't it? It seems like, well, of course, we want to block by default people's access to websites that are doing stuff like this, putting up big red download buttons that look like they're going to be what you want and are actually going to take you to adware or possibly even malware. So, yeah, surely that's a good thing. Until you think, well, who decides exactly what is misleading, and who decides which websites actually make it onto that blacklist? And this is got real potential to be abused or manipulated to effectively censor things that they don't want you to see.
Yeah, I was trying to work out whether it was done through some sort of algorithm, you know, some sort of automated sort of Google script that goes and scours the internet, or whether it's something that users can flag up and say, don't like the look of this, don't like the look of this. And if you get, you know, 100 in a week, then this goes onto the list. It doesn't really make it very clear how they're going to actually pick the websites.
Yeah, and this manipulation of search results and actual search traffic, the websites you land on, is something we've touched on previous shows. And was it this week I saw the story about Google changing search results for people looking for jihadi websites into ones that are sort of counter-jihadi?
Yeah, to be fair, that is only in the sponsored links, but it is still a manipulation of their search results.
Yeah, but I guess if they're doing this sort of thing very effectively, you won't even notice, and that really could be a bit of a problem going forwards. But let's just stay with this deceptive downloads button issue for a moment. And obviously one of the sites that we've talked about in the past that suffered from dubious links, shall we say, on it is SourceForge. And SourceForge and Slashdot, which are both owned by Dice Holdings currently, have been sold again. And on January 28th, Bizix, I think it is, BIZX, completed their purchase of those two sites from the much-hated Dice. And I don't like reading out long quotes on this show, but Logan Abbott from Bizix has said they're planning to attempt to resurrect the somewhat tarnished reputation of SourceForge, and he told Phosphorus that they plan to make SourceForge, quote, a trusted destination for open source software discovery, development, collaboration and distribution. And that we disagree with some of the previous monetization strategies from an industry and business perspective and have immediate plans to discontinue programs inconsistent with our being a trusted and reliable resource for the entire open source community. I think large and small project developers will quickly see that we're very serious about supporting their long-term needs, and that the industry will see we're more interested in doing the right thing than making a few extra short-term dollars. Too
little, too late. I mean, the previous discussion we've had on this show is how they've been injecting malware and third-party applications into the executables. So they even were so bad as when the GIMP project didn't like what they were doing, they took themselves off of SourceForge, and then SourceForge took GIMP and hosted it themselves, but having edited the binary so that you got extra things that the GIMP project weren't actually, you know, obviously didn't want extra things to be installed with it, and it was against their will, or at least without their sort of permission, as that sort of blew up in their face. And I think most projects have now moved over to GitHub, and it's probably one of those things that, while they might have said those things in the quote, I think they're too far down the line, and too many open source projects have turned their back on them for them to be able to actually turn the tide and bring it back to where they are, the most credible and most widely used open source hosting provider.
Yeah, I wonder how much is just emotional attachment. I mean, I was thinking about this because Slashdot is still a site I visit on a daily basis, despite the quality, which has been absolutely down the toilet for the last few years. You do occasionally see some interesting things, but I mean, mainly the value is still in the commentary from people below the line. And they've made various changes over the years at Slashdot, none of which have really stuck or gone down well with those of us who have been around a long time. So whether it is just nostalgia sort of tying us, or at least some of us, to these sites, I don't know. But yeah, they've certainly got the work cut out trying to turn SourceForge around.
Well, it's funny that you got as far as that quote, Paddy, because I got to the first bit of it that said, we're excited about the synergies this acquisition brings. And then I just sort of lost interest, I'm afraid. So let's move on and talk about CoreOS, and specifically their Rocket container engine. And it has reached the 1.0 release, so it is officially stable now. So this Rocket container engine is it fair to call it a competitor to Docker? It's certainly an alternative.
Yeah, I think it's fair to call it a competitor, and they set out with slightly different goals in mind, particularly from a security and size point of view.
Well, you talk about security there, but if you tweak the settings, you can run Docker images on there that are unsigned. So I'm not 100% sure. Maybe by default it's more secure, but it's certainly got the potential to be insecure.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe they're sort of trading security for compatibility in that case. But if you stick with the Rocket containers, then you keep that security. And sticking with containers in general, and onto micro containers. So Iron.io has announced that they are releasing these micro containers. What they've done is taken Docker, which the standard image is 644 meg, and then stripped it and squeezed it down to 29 meg. The idea being there that having a smaller container means that you can deploy them more quickly across PCs because they're smaller to copy, and having less code means that you have a smaller attack surface. So it improves the security of the Docker containers.
Yeah, and although it doesn't say it in the story we're going to link to in the show notes, one of the ways they've achieved this is actually by moving the base for the container over to Alpine Linux.
Yes, Alpine Linux is this security-orientated, sort of very lightweight distribution. And it seemed like a really good idea, such a good idea, that Docker itself is moving its official images over to Alpine Linux. So they're getting that benefit of having a much smaller base, and therefore the deployment will be quicker, and because the code base is much smaller.
Yeah, you've got to feel a bit for Iron.io, who came out with this announcement, and then just days later, Docker have said they're doing exactly the same thing. But anyway, let's shift gears totally and talk about Firefox OS. We've talked about it on the show on many occasions, and we've also reported that Mozilla is effectively killing it off for mobile devices, but intends to keep it going for things like smart TVs. Further details have since come out, and Mozilla have said that apparently version 2.6 will be the last version they're going to be supporting, and that all staff will be pulled from work on the project by May this year. They've also said they're planning to keep accepting native Firefox OS apps into the store until 2017, though. And that struck me as a little bit odd, because surely with these smart TVs from Panasonic and the like that they're pushing out there, they're going to want apps. So if all they're committing to is another year and a half's worth of app support from the App Store, does that not throw their sort of future into question as well?
Well, I'd have to ask whether or not that App Store is the same for the phone as the TV. It's a very different interface. One's touch and small, and one is from a remote and very large. So I don't think you're going to be using the same apps in the phone App Store as you would the TV App Store necessarily.
Oh, perhaps I'm just showing my ignorance because I've never actually seen one of these smart TVs in real life.
Oh, they'll blow your mind. They're amazing. I have a smart Samsung TV, and after about a year and a half of it was always slow, but it's just so clunky, it's unusable. And as I say, after about a year and a half, the applications and stuff just didn't really run at all well. So now I've got a Roku, and that's the smart part of my TV.
What's a TV?
Oh, God. Move us along, Paddy, before he starts again.
Yeah, we'll do very quickly. I'll stay with Mozilla, though. Firefox have very quietly dumped what strikes me as being a privacy feature. And version 44 has removed the Ask Me Every Time option for accepting or rejecting cookies, and now it just has an accept or reject functionality. And user reports suggest that not only has the default behavior been set to accept, but also that previously user-generated exception lists that people have made up using the old Ask Me Every Time option are simply being wiped out. So by default, it will be accepting all cookies, and any exceptions you've previously set have disappeared. Now, I obviously don't use Firefox, so I'm not even seeing any of the betas for this. But this strikes me as yet another example of the foolishness going on over at Mozilla.
It strikes me as the same. I mean, this is their core product that we're talking about. The core thing that they do, the thing for which they are best known is the Firefox browser. And they've repeatedly made bad decisions. And this is yet another one. Although, to be fair, I don't think it's going to be one that's going to get a lot of publicity. It's quite a kind of behind the scenes thing. It's less obvious than adding Pocket in there, for example.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. And you could also argue that because the market share is now so low for Firefox, that it doesn't really matter. I mean, I'd be tending to argue the opposite of that the market share is really low, and it's only people who are interested in features like this that are still using Firefox, and therefore it's the very last thing you want to be doing.
Yeah, again, I agree.
So maybe it doesn't happen on Chrome, or maybe I've got some setting that auto agrees to it, or what have you. Is it a case that when you go onto a website that has cookies, I know the website itself says we use cookies, and your only option then is okay, you never get to choose, but is there then sort of a Firefox pop-up that says, we've recorded cookies, do you want us to delete them or keep them? Is that sort of a pop-up that comes up?
No, it's something you have to go into menus to find.
Okay.
I presume you can do something similar in Chrome.
Yeah, I must admit it's something I've never looked for in Chrome, but it's something I always used to have turned on in Firefox back in the day when I did use it, and it was nice, sort of a comfort blanket, being able to block out certain cookies from certain sites. Anyway, Mozilla aren't the only company we've spoken about recently that are in somewhat dire straits on the mobile front, are they?
Indeed. Yarr. The Yarr tablet, which a lot of people have been eagerly anticipating and waiting for, and it's not going to happen for most of them, unfortunately. Most people who backed the Indiegogo to get one of these Yarr tablets are not going to get the tablet, but they are going to get a refund, which at least is something. Some people will be getting them because they've managed to manufacture about 500 and something of them, but that is a tiny, tiny percentage of the people who backed the project in the first place. So it's an abject failure.
I think you're being really generous there, to be honest. I mean, not obviously with the abject failure comment, which is fair enough, but as you say, it's only sort of 500 odd that are going to get shipped out of the door, and that's to, 21,500 people who originally put up money to get one.
Yeah.
And you talk about refunds. I mean, the money isn't being refunded now. It is being refunded in the future. Possibly, maybe, is how it's being spun on the Jolly blog. So I wouldn't hold my breath for that either.
Yeah, that is a good point, actually. Just because they say they're going to refund people doesn't actually mean that it's happening.
Well, with some slightly better news for the Yarr team who are producing Selfish OS, and some slightly bizarre news, that the Turing phone we covered mid last year, and it was supposed to come out in sort of middle of December. Then they missed that date, and they said by the end of Q1, and they missed that date, and they said now that it's probably going to be out in April. And in this latest announcement, the April release date has come along with them saying, oh, and we're switching from Android to Selfish OS, by the way, which seems like quite a major shift. So, I mean, if you've bought a phone thinking in 3 months, 4 months, whatever it is, it's going to come out, it's going to be the super secure phone, is the whole point of the Turing phone, and they suddenly shift the operating system on it, that is a sort of a fundamental part of the phone, and you might not want Selfish OS, even if it does run Android apps on top of it.
Yeah, even if it's going to have the Play Store. When we looked at the Yarr phone, it was okay, the Android app support, but it wasn't 100%, and it's definitely not what people signed up for when they gave their money. So disingenuous, fraud. I mean, where do you draw the line on this? To me, it's absolutely outrageous. If I had paid for an Android phone and then they delivered me a selfish OS phone, I would be very, very angry about that.
Yeah, we'll have to see if they actually come out in April, because they don't seem to be particularly good at meeting the deadlines they set themselves. And then how well it runs. I mean, it claims that it's running smoothly and has been optimized for it, but you would, of course, say that in an announcement, wouldn't you?
Well, that's a bit of a sour note to end the news on. So let's cheer ourselves up with an interview about something a lot more positive. I'm delighted to say we're now joined by Graham Morrison, who is the editor of Linux Voice, the magazine, and also the podcast. So welcome, Graham.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone. It's good to be here.
So the reason we've got you on is to talk about Beep Beep Yarr. Now, this is a children's book that you are currently trying to kickstart. So sell it to me.
Well, we genuinely have had this idea knocking around for a couple of years. Basically, we're a pretty geeky magazine. And a lot of us have got children or work with children, and we realise how important it is to get children really engaged with computers and what goes on behind the Netflix or their tablets or whatever they happen to be doing. And we wanted to try something different. We wanted to, stretch our legs a little bit. And so we wanted to create a book for children that is a really good story. Fundamentally, that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to have pirates and robots, but kind of inadvertently and secretly also teaches them some fundamental programming concepts.
But these programming concepts, it's not code, is it?
No, we're not going to put any code in the main story itself. I mean, the age... We're looking at about 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. So hopefully they can read it to themselves, or, you could read it to them at bedtime. So we don't want any kind of code or real geekery in the story itself. But it will kind of show how complicated ideas can be broken down and then tackled with some of the normal things you would do through writing a computer program. And then the other idea is that there's an interactive element that you go into a website and try out some of these bits at the end of each chapter in actual code, in actual kind of pseudo code, really.
And do you think that's necessary then to enjoy the book, or will it be possible to just have the book as a standalone?
The plan is really that the book as a standalone thing will be brilliant. That you can just read the book and enjoy the story, and hopefully children won't really realise they're learning about computer stuff, but we're trying to equip them with the kind of ways of thinking that will be effective when you start to write code. So really, no, standalone. The interactive element really just comes from us we've never seen anybody try something like this before. And we also we haven't mentioned it in the Kickstarter, but we wanted to have a reward system and kind of, we're thinking of putting in kind of like cookies into the interactive part that kids will then go into the next chapter with these ideas in their heads, and so that they can read the book again, or that they can find secret things through reading the book 2 or 3 or 4 times.
So the question that first popped into my mind was, why do you need to do a Kickstarter for this? Because presumably you've got all of the equipment to write it in the first place. Is it just to kind of finance the actual printing of it and the hard copies?
It's a good question, actually. No one's asked us yet. The truth is really that Linux Voice is kind of ticking along. It's not in any danger, but it's not really making any money either. There is no kind of... The money that we make in Linux Voice goes into Linux Voice, and we want that to remain the case. And the most part of the Kickstarter money for Beep Beep Yarr would actually go into probably paying contributors for a few months' work to write articles in Linux Voice that we would otherwise write, so that maybe Ben and I and Andrew can concentrate on the book for a few months. The printing, we estimate, would be maybe another big chunk of that money, but a big part of it is giving us the time from writing for Linux Voice to try and do Beep Beep Yarr.
And is it going to be illustrated? I mean, that's the impression that you get from the Kickstarter.
That's right. So we've been working with Chris, the illustrator, for about 4 or 5 months, working through the ideas of the main characters in the book and the settings and scenarios. And Chris has agreed to do the whole book with us. So if it's successful, we'll have a lot of illustration. I mean, I'm not sure whether the final book will be like this, but one of the original ideas when we first started talking about it was how great the old Usborne spy books used to be, and they used to have fantastic maps, kind of 3D isometric views looking down at a scene, and they'd have silly spy characters going around looking for clues. And it'd be great to have, along with a really good story, to have lots of great illustrations that kids can look at and get lots out of, because that's, in my experience, that's what children love to do.
So in terms of the cost of it, that's another thing that struck me, is it is quite expensive. And I'm not trying to be too down on it, but it is presumably a very expensive thing to put together then.
The Kickstarter target is for £20,000. If we make £20,000, we will be able to do exactly what we want to do, create a brilliant book, but it won't leave us with any extra money. That is actually exactly what we estimate it's going to cost. We'd like to be able to do more. If we get more money than that, then we'd like to offer translations, and we'd like to make the book itself a better package. But really, that is what it comes down to, is cost. If we kind of put aside 3 or 4 months' work for this, and maybe a month for the illustrator, as well as printing and postage. Postage is always a nightmare. You're kind of looking at splitting those into quarters or fifths, and a fifth of £20,000 for a couple of people, I don't think is that much money. So it's £25 for the book itself. And really, that's just us making a rough estimate of how many people will need to back the project to be able to get the money we need to make it happen. So if we'd have done it cheaper than that, we'd have had to have raised the price and raised the total for the campaign. And we thought that would be less likely to be achievable.
And do you expect it to be the same price retail? And well, I mean, that's another question. Is it going to be available retail, or is it only going to be available to the Kickstart people? I
think it's early. I was a backer of the Hello Ruby campaign from a couple of years ago, which I was hugely enthusiastic about. But one of the really bad things about that project was that you were able to buy Hello Ruby on Amazon for a fraction of the price of what the Kickstarters paid for it, and even before many of the Kickstarters got their books. So we're never going to do that. We haven't got a plan for the retail of the book, but I think we'd be foolish to not look into it. And if we did look into it, my best guess is that actually we'd create a different edition, probably not as good an edition as the edition we're going to create for Kickstarter and the one that we've got our quotes for. It certainly won't be the same book for cheaper available on Amazon in the same way that Hello Ruby was.
Oh, that's good to know. So you've got... as we record this, you're in about a week and you've got almost half of it. So it's looking pretty good. How does it compare to the original Kickstarter? Oh, well, it was an Indiegogo, wasn't it, for the magazine?
I must admit, so we're coming up to the magazine deadline. So I've been working crazy hours trying to do everything that needs to be done for the magazine, as have the other guys. So I haven't been obsessed with the Kickstarter total as I was with Linux Voice, where of course it kind of was our future as well in Linux Voice. We'd all given up our jobs, and I went to bed, picked with the phone by the side of the bed, and looked at the total through the night, which was a completely unhealthy state of mind to be in. And this, obviously, Beep Beep Yarr is significant, and we care a lot about it, but we're also really busy, and we care a lot about Linux Voice as well. In that way, it feels better that we've got a little bit of distance between us and the success of the project. I can see, it went up really quickly. We got like 5,000 in the first 24 hours, and it's been very quiet over the last week, but it's still ticking over, which feels good. It's also going to be an awful lot of work, putting Beep Beep Yarr together on top of doing the magazine together. We're doing it because we think it's a good idea. But it's also because magazines in general, I don't know what the future of magazines are in the next 4 or 5 years. It's still an incredibly difficult industry, and we're still finding it very difficult. And so being able to test things like this and maybe being able to do other things like this again in the future is makes me feel much better about Linux Voice and the whole project and technology and computing and programming and Linux, because this is the point of entry for open source.
So one thing that I really should ask you, you talked about how it's introducing kids to ideas of programming, but without actually having programming. Are you going to teach kids ideas about software freedom without actually teaching them it?
Yeah, maybe we should have said this, but I guess we just assumed that people would expect us to. It's a bit strange because it's now like the default way of thinking. It's certainly been the default way of thinking for me for a long time. And so I just kind of, well, yes, of course, I forget that it needs to be said. And maybe we should, make a point of that on the Beep Beep Yarr page, that of course we'll be using this to advocate free software, because what other way of doing programming in code is there? So yes, we will, and we should probably do a better job of communicating that.
Oh, well, that's what this kind of thing's for, hopefully. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. I know you're very busy, as you said, trying to get the magazine together for the deadline. But yeah, hopefully it's going to get kickstarted, and I'm sure it is, to be honest. I can't see it not happening. It seems to be so popular. And you always have that kind of parabola, don't you? Massive at the beginning, then a bit of a lull, and then towards the end it picks up. So I'm confident that you'll do it.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, no worries. Speak to you soon.
Bye.
On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to Tony Ryan for your very generous PayPal donation, and to our new monthly supporters, Martin Wimpress and Tom Ostring. So now I suppose we have to say nothing but good things about Ubuntu Mate. No, we probably would do anyway. But yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. And of course, our existing monthly supporters. It really helps us with so much running the servers and being able to buy little things here and there. So yeah, thank you very much. And contact details. You've not put it big and red, Paddy, so I almost missed it there. So you can email us, show@linuxluddites.com, or you can find us on Twitter, Google+, and Facebook, or you can leave a comment on the website.
Now, getting on to the feedback, I'll just sort of summarise a bunch of feedback that we got from various different platforms. So Joel, Jeremy, Will and Nigel all sort of got in contact to talk about the web browser feature that we discussed, and all sort of basically persuading Joe to look at Chromium, because your big argument of using Firefox was that it's an open source browser, and they were pointing out that Chromium is as well, but that you can install non-free plugins like Flash and things. And Joel suggests that maybe you use it for a week and review it as if you were Pale Moon, with sort of a fresh look at it and just try and see if it meets your needs. So are you going to maybe look at Chromium rather than the full-blown proprietary Chrome?
Well, Chromium is something that I usually have installed on most of my machines. And for me, it just doesn't seem worth the effort of installing the proprietary plugins and bits to make it work like Chrome when I could just install Chrome. So I always keep Chromium just totally vanilla. And so I often have Firefox, Chromium, and Chrome installed on the same system. So it's not going to be my main browser, I don't suppose, because what's the point when you can just install Chrome and have all that stuff out of the box and have the later version of Flash rather than an older one, and have Hangouts work seamlessly without having to install something extra. So I probably should, but then again, I probably won't. And what I really should do is a brand new Firefox installation. I should just delete my profile and build it up again, and hopefully get rid of the profile bloat problem, and maybe that would be the answer. But again, there's only so many hours in the day, and I'm not going to spend them customizing Firefox again, so I'll just probably keep complaining about it instead.
Happily complaining. Funnily enough, I found myself one of those, well, not an hour, but certainly 20 minutes or so, to go through all of my Chrome extensions and say, well, I installed that and used it for like 3 days and I've forgotten about it, or there's this one that we reviewed, or this one that I put on my Chromebook and now no longer use, and it sort of has permeated and synced across all my Chrome browsers. And so I went through and I was quite happy to get rid of a load of stuff that's there. I mean, I'm not going to say it's made it any quicker or anything, but just seems like a little bit of a spring clean.
It's interesting where we are in the browser space, though, because they are all tending and trending towards becoming operating systems fundamentally and just getting very big and bloated and slow. I mean, you mentioned the amount of RAM they consume at the moment. And it was good to go back and look at some lighter ones, but how much of the issue we have with them is actually down to coding and the extra functionality they're adding, and how much is just down to HTML and CSS getting more and more complex? I'm not really sure, but we've certainly moved away from the agile web that we used to have. And when I was thinking about Chrome, and Chrome really took off because it was so much faster and lighter than Firefox originally, and that's certainly not the case now.
Are you saying you can't really judge them because the websites they're loading are the heavy part, whereas Chrome now could well be as fast as it was when it was first released, but that the web they're serving is the heavy part?
Yeah, a bit of both. Well, we also talked about accelerated mobile pages recently, and that's obviously is an attempt by Google, well, apart from corralling us all into their little world, supposedly, ostensibly, it's an attempt to make the mobile web faster. And Twisted Lucidity got in touch and said, with regards to AMP, it's nonsense and little more than an attempt by Google to gain even more control over what people see and then data mine the living hell out of them without actually solving the problem at all. The people who get excited about this are going to be the same cretins who think it's a great idea to use Google's DNS. It's not even the fault of the frontline devs. It's more a fault of the managers and designers who think every page must have social media links, comment sections, and videos and graphical simulation all over practicality. A good dev or design team should be able to create a working page that gets the content front and centre in well under 1 megabyte. Unless the content is itself graphical, there's really no excuse for it to be over that. Heavy use of graphics and dynamic content also make life hell for screen readers.
Yeah, I think these are points that we did cover when we talked about AMP in the news section last fortnight, because the only reason you need this is the fact that people are now using the web on their mobile devices a lot more, and they're only being served by 4G if you're doing well, potentially 3G, and it becomes incredibly annoying waiting for it. I think we all agreed that basically it's the amount of sort of bling and extra cruft that goes onto the website to link to social media and have comments and things like this and adverts that pop up in front of the page you're trying to read that make it all a big problem. So it'd be nice if you didn't need AMP, but for the mobile, you may well need it just to have a more pleasant way of using it. Now, I know that's not getting to the point that Twisted Lucidity is making. He's making a fairly good point that we shouldn't be putting more into Google, but that may well be the way we end up.
Yeah, and Twisted also linked us to a website that discusses the growing website obesity crisis, as it puts it. And I think that's a really excellent read. So I'll stick a link in the show notes to that as well.
Well, changing topic, Peter Kidd got in touch to say, something struck me while listening to the most recent show while you were discussing the merits of various cloud-based systems. If I heard correctly, there was some discussion of whether you should store data in the cloud with the risk that that data could become inaccessible when you can't go online, when the company goes bust or if they discontinue the service. I use Google Drive for things I expect to access rarely or never, but I use Dropbox for all of my day-to-day data and current work. The whole point about Dropbox, it seems to me, is that it is not the main repository of your data. That remains your computer's hard drive. It's instead a backup and a channel by which your data is synced to or made available to other devices. If Dropbox closed down tomorrow with no warning, I would still have all my data safe and sound on my main work PC. Well, that's cloud storage, but we were talking more about cloud services, weren't we? Things like Gmail, for example, where if Gmail went away tomorrow, I wouldn't have all my emails because I hadn't backed them up. So there is a clear distinction to me between just pushing up stuff to a server somewhere for safekeeping or, as an extra copy of it as a backup, and services like Google Drive, for example, where we've got all our show docs that we can search back through and find information if we want to. And we don't have a copy of that locally. I mean, we could easily do that, but I don't know about you guys. I have never backed up our show docs.
No, maybe that's something we need to think about. But it's interesting that Peter made this point. It sort of rang a chord with me because I used to use Dropbox entirely for my cloud storage. So I would, store pictures that I was particularly happy with, or maybe custom background images that I'd made, and I'd store them on there so I could have them wherever I went, or when I formatted my PC, they're always available. But I always used to sync it back locally as well. And the problem hit when all of the sort of notes and memos that I made to myself in Linux don't need .txt after them. But Dropbox doesn't recognize them if they don't have a file extension. So you can't open them and use your phone to edit them, or use a tablet whilst you're not at your PC. You can only edit them from the PC interface because you're opening it locally, aren't you? And so I moved over to Google Docs for all of those little notes and reminders, and when you try and use this command, these are the sorts of things you should be thinking of, Jesse. So because you can see them on the web within Google Docs, and you don't have to have an extension, you can edit them and look at them on your phone, and it's just more usable from my use case. The massive problem being there isn't a Google Doc or a Google Drive way of storing locally made by Google, whereas Dropbox automatically downloads it to your PC locally. I'm only editing them now on the web. So I've sort of gone from one where it was local and on the web, but I couldn't really mess around with them on the web that I wanted to one where I can now use it on the web and on my phone, but they're not stored locally anymore. And so I've sort of not found the middle ground that I want.
Yeah, it is difficult. I must say Peter's comment chimed with me, though, because I tend to work in exactly the same way. I use Drive for things I don't change very often, or I want to be able to edit easily, as you do, Jesse. And I use Dropbox for stuff I want to be shuttled about between all my machines, including my phone. I mean, I run DropSync on my phone because I'm too tight to pay for the Dropbox app. But things like password files that are encrypted are automatically copied across to every device I own, so I can gain access using KeePassX, and just little things like that. It's a great mechanism for work in progress, if you like, or things you need access to everywhere you go.
On a previous show, we had a discussion about ad blocking software, and it came up in the news. And Robert Ozana got in touch just to sort of point out this ad blocker called Fair Ad Block by a company called Stans. And what this does is it does all the usual ad blocking that you would expect it to do, but actually allows through charities and things. So while it blocks nearly all the adverts, it will allow adverts if they're from a charitable basis, and therefore those charities make money because you're viewing their ad, and if you're clicking on it, they make more money. So it's sort of a socially responsible, perhaps, ad blocker. So it's sort of in the middle between blocking everything and blocking some things.
So is this some sort of plugin or extension for browser?
Yeah, the same as all of the AdBlock Plus and things like this would be. Or uBlock Origin, now I've been told about that one.
Yeah. Get with the cool kids.
Yeah. But I don't know, maybe I'm a bad person, but I don't want to see any adverts, even if they're for a good cause, I'm afraid.
Yeah, you're a bad person.
Well, last time we were here, we were talking about React OS, and Nigel Green got in touch and said, regarding our discussion, is there really any need for the Floss community to have an OS that is free and open source if its main use case is for people to use it to run Photoshop and Pro Tools et al.? While I agree that there is a real lack of alternatives here, would it not be better for the community to invest in better Floss alternatives to the apps and leave people who need the proprietary versions to use Windows to run these? If there is any mix and match to do, then I think my preference is for a proprietary program that runs under Linux as an interim, as this at least supports developers who see Linux as a viable platform. And Nigel mentions Bitwig Studio as a good example of this, that's proprietary but runs quite happily under Linux.
Well, I do take the point that Nigel's making there, but for me, I still think that it is a good project in theory, because there's a bit more to having to run Windows than just some things like Pro Tools and Photoshop. There are things that you need at work, Paddy, aren't there, that only work in Windows?
There are, sadly, yeah. We've got asset management databases and such like that are Windows specific.
So I think there is still a use case for it, but as we discovered when we checked it out, it's so far from being ready, and the ground keeps moving from underneath it as new versions of Windows come out, that it's just never, ever going to catch up, I don't suppose. But you never know, if someone threw enough money at it and development time, maybe it would be a viable option. But that'll do it for the feedback then. Let's move on and talk about Tails. Within the last week or so, Tails 2.0 has been released. Now, for those who don't know, Tails is a distro based on Debian that is designed to be run live from a USB stick or a DVD or an SD card. And I suppose its main feature is that all of the network traffic is routed through Tor. And also, it doesn't touch any of your hard disks in the machine that you're running it on, unless you specifically want it to. So whereas something like, say, Ubuntu or Fedora will detect that you have got a swap partition and utilize it if necessary, Tails will not do that. You can save files if you want to the hard drive of the machine you're running it on, but it won't by default. And it's received quite a lot of publicity over the last couple of years. Snowden professed to use it to communicate with various journalists. So the question is this 2.0 release any good? Well, you have to actually get it running first before you can see if that's the case. And I suppose that's the best place to start, isn't it? How do you get it installed? It's not quite as simple as something like Ubuntu or Fedora.
Yeah, I thought there was going to be a fairly simple setup because of the way in which they held your hand through the option process. And I was really impressed when they sort of said which operating system you're installing it from and what will you need, and there's sort of tick boxes and a workflow that basically gets you to where you need to be. However, when it says that, let's say you select Windows, it says you can't install Tails directly from Windows. You need to make an intermediary Tails install and then install the second and final Tails. So you need 2 USB sticks and you need to then download it and checksum it and do all these things. And it starts to get a little bit complicated. So basically, to install Tails, you need, or they say you need, 2 USB sticks unless you're running one of the most recent Ubuntu or Debian installs.
The reality, of course, is you can just download the ISO and DD it onto a USB stick and boot into it. And that's what I had done with the release candidate. And then I went out partying, I suppose you might say, to watch some bands. And you two started having a bit of a natter over email about your tales of woe with it. And suddenly I got rather worried that maybe something had changed. But if you do just download it and DD it, you can use it, but then you are slightly limited by some of the features that it offers.
Yeah, as you say, it works fine, and that's actually how I got it onto one USB stick and then went through the built-in installer for the second USB stick, and that's incredibly straightforward, actually. I think the website just makes things more complicated than it needs to, and on the whole, I was really impressed with the Tails website. It's got really thorough documentation everywhere. As Jesse said, it's quite clearly laid out. It's just the install process. They seem to be trying to confuse you. I mean, they'd like you to download the ISO, not from a direct link, which is you have to hunt around for a little bit, and I found eventually, but via a Firefox extension. So it does things like CRC checking, or via torrents, again, so that you actually know you've got the right file. And it just seems to be trying too hard, I think.
It seems to me that they try and put up a bit of a barrier to entry here. Even when you first go to the website, it says to you, are you looking for this, that, and the other? Well, this isn't for you then. And it's the sort of total opposite of Debian, which is supposed to be the universal operating system. This is trying to say you have to be able to meet some technical challenges in order to use this. And that's a strange attitude, I think.
But we always discuss who is this aimed at, and this is aimed at the tech savvy, the people who are aware of the idea of privacy and this is the amnesic operating system, so it forgets who you are and things like this. And so you do need to be fairly tech savvy. I mean, if someone who wasn't really sure what they were doing would then wonder what's this Tor thing all about? If you're asking that question, you're not really the person who should be running this, are you?
Well, I have to take issue with that a bit, because I don't think that it's necessarily going to be tech-savvy people who know all about Linux and stuff that are going to want to use this. It could be people who just have some privacy requirements, and they can learn about the idea of Tor in about 5 minutes, probably less than that. And if it was made really, really easy for them to then fire up Tails and be able to communicate anonymously. Well, that's a debate for another day, but at least use Tor for all of their traffic. I don't know. I just don't think that the two necessarily go hand in hand.
Now, I've got to say, I think they have changed who they're targeting somewhat. Because in the olden days, those of us who knew about it would get a Tails CD, or would burn a Tails CD or DVD as it is now due to the size, onto writable media, so we know that no one's going to be adding to it after the event, and wander off down a coffee shop and do whatever we've got to do. And now it's considerably larger. USB is really necessary to actually get the best out of this. And it's got lots of software there, like a full-blown Office suite. And it strikes me that they probably are targeting journalists and such like, rather than people doing things they probably shouldn't be doing.
Well, you talk about the software that it's got a video editor.
Absolutely. It's looking far more like a standard desktop. And I know we're sort of talking around the topic rather than looking at the distro itself, but I kind of think that's more interesting, to be honest, because who this is designed at and how they actually implement it is an interesting thing in itself. I mean, we're talking about having to use USB now, and particularly if you want persistence, you obviously do need that option there. But they make a big play on the website about not being able to install to your hard disk, or saying it's really difficult to and they don't recommend you do so. But surely if you're using a USB stick, that's just the same as having it installed to your hard disk, and the persistence things would work in exactly the same manner. So I really don't understand why they're not going down that route, if just providing a secure, if you like, operating environment for a hard disk.
Yeah, it makes sense to have it be an option, certainly, yeah. I don't know about default, but if it's as it is now, but there's an option from within it to install to a hard disk, then that would make a lot of sense.
Okay, I mean, well, the topic of who it's aimed at is maybe a greater discussion, and I get your point, Joe, that it is normal people who should be able to use it, but perhaps there are hurdles and to get a operating system which has the security that Tails purports to have. You need to go through a number of hoops, and if people are able to research it in 5-10 minutes to get up to that speed and get over those hurdles, then all the better, and they can get using it. But as Paddy said, you can download it and DD it, but the way they recommend is that you install the Tails installer, which once you've downloaded the ISO, you only need one USB, and the Tails installer does the install onto that. Now, it didn't work on Mint 17, which was the distro I had on my PC originally, and so I went round looking for a spare hard disk and downloaded 15.10 of Ubuntu, and because you have to have 15.10 for the Tails installer PPA to work. So got that, installed that, spent a lot of time trying to get USB sticks that would work, and it kept on getting to the grub menu to pick whether you want it live or live in safe mode. And it just wouldn't work, and it just wouldn't work. I tried a couple of USB sticks and then found that these SanDisks that I'd bought, which are 4 gig because they're perfect size for having distros tested on them, have a certain feature for Windows or some sort of weird thing inside them that means that Tails doesn't work with them. So after much frustration, I realized I had fundamentally the wrong actual little USB stick. So swapped it out to a more useful one, DD'd it in the end because I was getting so frustrated as you guys did. And then on that USB pen, installed the Tails installer because my 15.10 Tails installer also had failed all over the place. It was just a bit of a nightmare. So once I'd got onto a DD'd image, you can't use the persistent partition, which is obviously quite important when you're reviewing a live install and the benefits of having certain files or maybe, let's get onto this later, installed software and things. So got that installed onto the initial USB pen, and then using their installer, made a second one, and then your persistent partition works, and you can use it, on any computer, and you can keep files and things that you want to keep. So from there, you get to the main install, and we're on to distro review time.
Well, you say you can use it on any computer. Well, it wouldn't work on my test of IO, unfortunately, and I find it really hit and miss as to where it'll boot. And if you do a straight DD, it will generally boot on anything. But if you use the Tails installer, then I find that it's very picky about what it'll boot on. And I often get boot error even before grub. So it's been tricky to test this out properly. But okay, let's get on to once you actually do get it booted up. having used the installer, you're faced with GNOME, but not GNOME shell as we know it.
Well, before you're faced with that, you're faced with their welcome screen.
Well, much like with Ubuntu Mate, I just closed that immediately. So I'm afraid I didn't look at it.
You're missing out on the key options of Tails. So this is the Tails greeter, and it says, welcome to Tails. Would you like more options? Yes or no? And when you say yes, you can type in an admin password, because by default it doesn't have one, because that is more secure than having one. And you can choose whether or not to have your MAC addresses being spoofed, and that's on by default. And then you can decide what your network options are, going from just standard, as in Wi-Fi, RJ45 and things, or whether or not you've got something more complicated, a proxy or a firewall, or most secure of all, none. So once you've picked those and what sort of security things you want. So I mean, if you want to install software, obviously you need to select an admin password to be able to then install software. So that's one of the options in the Tails greeter.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I did do that eventually. The first time I just said, just log me in quickly, get rid of this. But yeah, I did go through all that. I was just kind of joking there, really. And yeah, once you have set your admin password, then you can do security updates, install software, and do everything that you need. So it is pretty much essential to do that, I think.
Yeah, you might be confusing people talking about installing software there, because this is a distro that can be booted off read-only media.
Yes, but it's running in RAM, isn't it? So it's much like with an Ubuntu live session, you can install stuff there, and it's just, if you don't have persistence, then that's not going to be there next time you boot.
Yeah, so I thought if I had a persistent directory, which I set up, it would then install stuff to that persistent directory, so that once you installed the application or two that you wanted that wasn't already there, and like you guys alluded to earlier, there is a sensible range of software already there. But actually what happens is, as you say, you install it, and the next time you boot it up, no matter what you do, there's no way of having that installation there every time. Instead, what you're allowed to do is write the applications that you want to be installed into a particular file within the persistent directory, and once it gets a network, it will do an update and install of those every single time you boot your PC. So you can have things there available without having to install them manually, but you do have to wait like 5 minutes for them to be ready, because obviously it's doing all this in the background and installing it in the background.
Yeah, and it's also piping everything through Tor. So if you've got potentially hundreds of megabytes to download, you're looking at, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 megabits per second tops, usually less than that, compared to my 200 that I'm used to.
Yeah, and although it's not very slick at the moment, this sort of persistent app side of things, it does work. It's slow, and it's something they're continuing to progress. I mean, it's a fairly new feature they're introducing there. But let's go back to software installation speeds. I mean, you mentioned Tor there, Joe, but did you also find that apt itself was really, really slow within the distro?
Not particularly. I found that once it had sucked down the stuff that needed, then it was fine. I didn't no real difference from what I'm used to.
Is that because you're running off? Sorry, not back to Joe, back to Paddy. Is that slow because you're running off a USB though?
I don't think so. No, it just seemed horribly slow when it was just doing app database updates and such, like not from a network traffic point of view, but just generally. But obviously, it was just me. If you two didn't notice. So come on then, let's take it back to the desktop, and it's a GNOME classic sort of looky thing. So you've got an applications menu and a places menu, and also a window list extension, so you can easily see which windows you've got open down the bottom of the screen. Yeah,
it's all quite sensibly laid out, I think. In terms of the interface, I'd prefer something that I'm more used to, like LXDE or XFCE or Mate. But if you're going to use GNOME, then this is the way to do it, I think.
Well, having just upgraded to Ubuntu GNOME, I'm going to disagree, but I agree. For this purpose and for running live off a USB, a nice lightweight GNOME Classic is sensible, and it's running on top of Debian 8, Debian Jessie. So once you've got through the Tails greeter, after a little while, so I used it on a wired connection, and therefore I didn't have to do any of the setup or anything for the Wi-Fi. So it recognised the network, and it firstly synchronizes the clock so that Tor works properly, and then maybe a minute or so later a little pop-up comes up and says Tor is now established, you can use the internet. So it does those things automatically, but it does mean that you can't access the internet straight away if you want to access it through Tor, as obviously you're supposed to do using Tails. So the internet access they have is through the Tor browser, which is basically Firefox with a Tor extension. But they do also have I can't remember what it's called now, like a wild browser or an unsecure browser or something or other, which is a normal web browser going straight to the internet, not going through Tor. And its symbol is a little warning triangle. And the first time you boot it up, it says, "Are you sure you want to do this? This isn't secure." So they're clearly, pushing you towards the Tor browser to make sure that all your traffic is routed through Tor.
So I mentioned it got a full Office suite involved here, and Joe talked about a video editor. What else have we got installed, Jesse?
Well, putting to one side some of the more standard applications, Terminal and gedit and things like this that you would expect to see, and as you say, the Office suite, there were some applications that I thought were quite security conscious or cryptographically conscious. So they had Electrum Bitcoin Wallet, Lifera, which is an RSS feeder I've never heard of, GTK Hash for allowing you to produce hashes for files in MD5, SHA-1 and SHA-256, Poedit is a translation editor, which seems like a very odd thing to have, but maybe that's for when you're in different countries, journalists and things. Traverso is a multi-track audio editor. Dasher for predictive text entry, and I tried to use this Dasher thing, and it is a wild and terrible thing. I cannot understand how it works. And then finally, something which I think more distros actually need is an application called Whisperback. And basically, it's a bug fixing form. So you can open this up and type in the various problems you've been having and send it off to them. Rather than having to go onto the website and log in things like this, you can just send them an issue form. And I've not seen that before in a distribution. But yeah, there was some odd applications there, but a few of them were definitely clearly aimed at security and privacy.
Yeah, I thought it was quite a usable set of desktop apps, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about I don't understand why you can't install this persistently, the actual distro itself, on your hard disk, because they make a big thing out of the fact you can't. While we're talking about persistence then, how did you guys find that work in practice? I mean, for me, it worked exactly as advertised. You could set it up, files would be saved quite happily away in an encrypted volume. It recorded things like your wireless password and what applications you'd installed, and happily replayed those next time you booted off the same media, so you didn't have to re-enter details every time.
Well, I did find that it worked as advertised, but it's got a fundamental flaw as far as I'm concerned, and that is security updates. I don't know why I expected it to remember and to have had the new updates installed on the next boot. But it just doesn't, does it? Which at the moment is not a huge issue. It's only been out a week or so, and there aren't that many security updates available when you boot it. So it's a relatively quick process, because clearly in a distro that is so based around privacy and security, that is the first thing that anyone is going to want to do, is get it up to date. But in a few months, the list of updates is going to be so long that it's going to be a real pain every time you boot it to sit through this fairly slow download over Tor and then waiting for it to install them before you can get on with whatever it is that you wanted to get on with.
Yeah, I'm not sure how fair that is, though, because their expectation is that you'd approach things differently. And if you look at their website, they shove out a new version every few weeks. And they, I think, expect you to have the 2 USB sticks we talked about previously, and you're constantly downloading the new version and then using that to clone onto the version that you're currently running and that has your persistent volume attached. And that doesn't overwrite any of your own user data, but keeps the operating system fully up to date.
So instead of downloading just a couple of 100 megabytes every time, now I have to download a whole distro every few weeks. Surely there's a way to write these updated files and security fixes to the USB stick in the first place. Wouldn't that just make a lot more sense?
Well, I guess if you're looking at it from a trust point of view, you know you can trust the Tails guys, whereas you're not quite sure what's happening to your traffic after you've already got the installation medium. I don't know is the short answer, but I mean, that's my take on how they're expecting people to use this.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that point, but having listened to your discussion, I do think that maybe you're right, Paddy, that they expect you to keep on doing this and therefore keep all the security updates within the ISO itself. The one other little nicety that I saw was that they have an on-screen keyboard available within the toolbar. So it's the Florence on-screen keyboard, and it's just one of those things that you can see them nodding towards the fact that you might not want to go to an internet cafe and be typing your password in with the keyboard. So instead, the physical keyboard, instead you can use this on-screen one in order to get your password and things. So there are a lot of nods towards understanding where the security flaws are generally in systems and how you're going to work around them if you're, are using this for its very purpose.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of touches like that, to be honest. I mean, even things like when you close the distro down, it does a memory wipe for you so that if you walk away from a box, even when it's turned off, I mean, it's possible to attack the RAM with no power being put into a box, sadly. But this sort of obviates that and gets around that problem.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that I think was well done is the persistent section. As we've touched on it a number of times. I think the reason for that is that it is the part which stands this apart from a normal live distribution, because normally you either have fully live or your whole home partition is persistent. But this one, it has, as you said, an encrypted persistent partition, and in that Tails greeter, once you've set up that persistent partition by going into the specific program, so there's I think it's persistent setup or something. Once you get to that greeter again, it then says, please type in your password to be able to access your persistent, your encrypted persistent partition. And within there, while you can edit this configuration file to do an automatic install, you can also make a .files folder, which allows you to have things like, well, I've got a custom bash RC, so to test this, I put that in there, and it means that every time I open up the terminal, I have the bash prompt and the colors and the features that I want in the way that I want it, and so you don't lose those sort of little niceties, but they're all there, available and encrypted, ready for you to come back to your system as you recognise it.
Yeah, and it's standard encryption as well. They're not done anything sort of totally off the wall here, because you can take your persistent volume and plug it into a normal Linux distro and decrypt it quite happily. And that's a positive, but I also think it's a bit of a negative. I mean, I can see people who want to be using a system like Tails would probably want some plausible deniability going on, and there doesn't appear to be any way to set that up. I mean, when you decrypt a volume, you decrypt a volume and all the data is there. It's not like TrueCrypt, for instance, where people quite often have hidden volumes within an encrypted volume.
Yeah, that would make sense, actually, for the kind of person who this is aimed at would probably want to be able to do that kind of stuff. So maybe they'll put it in future versions. But so bringing this to a bit of a conclusion then, I suppose the big question is, are we going to use it? Clearly, it's not supposed to be your daily driver, your day-to-day operating system, but are any of us going to continue to use it going forward?
Well, from my point of view, I ended up with it on my only USB 3 thumb drive, and it is the one that I bought, which is absolutely tiny in profile, which means that once you've plugged it into a laptop, what have you, you're unlikely to knock it out. And I bought this one specifically for this and specifically for the speed, and it's 32 gigs, so it's big enough to have some files on it. And so I'm actually quite pleased that it ended up on there, because it means that it's the most likely one that I could take around with me on a laptop or on, when I'm abroad or something and use it. So apart from the bit of an issue with the updates, in the fact that I'm going to have to re-download it when I go abroad and plan it, I'm really pleased that I got to look at it. And, it's part of the joy of the podcast is the fact that I thought it was going to be a nightmare. It was really nice to use. They've thought about a lot of things. Every single thing is a nod towards privacy and security. For example, they use disconnect.me as the search engine, and that holds no cookies and things about you. So I was very impressed and would use it for the reasons that they've made it.
Yeah, as would I. It is still sat on a USB stick, and I intend to leave it on a USB stick. I thought the whole thing was really well done. The website was nice and clear, apart from the installation instructions, which I feel they're just trying to confuse people, to be honest. because all you've got to do is DD it to one stick and then use the onboard tool to actually burn it onto another stick to get your persistence. The distro is nicely put together. It's got nice theming, even within GNOME there, and it runs reasonably snappily for a GNOME environment as well. And the tools are right. It may be excessive for most of us, the amount of software it comes with, but it is a full desktop environment, and I could see it being useful in a variety of scenarios, to be honest.
Well, that's the thing with me. It's now going to be part of my toolkit, and it's something that I know about, and I know what it does, and I could see myself going to it and using it. But the problem is, what for? I don't really have any need for it, or I only have a need for a secure, easy-to-use system, and I already have that. So I don't really need to connect to the internet using Tor. So you've said, Paddy, that you've got a couple of use cases for it, and I just don't really have. I suppose maybe one or two here and there, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. But if you're the kind of person who does want to do some stuff online totally anonymously, or at least as close to that as you can get, then I would say this is definitely the place to start with it. But with that, we've come to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or at the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, all.
See you later.